So here we are at session 4 of the first module, and tonight you're going to hear lots of comments and questions from the participants because they're starting to grasp some of these ideas of the moving from the medical to the biblical model. And it's not just about their interest and their engagement, it's also about how they're struggling to come to terms with how you shift across to that model. And I think that's a really good indicator of how much we're literally saturated in this way of thinking, what we call, or what the Bible calls, man's wisdom. And so you're going to hear a lot of people who struggle to grasp the idea of what we do in difficult relationships, or how we use difficult relationships to become an overcomer. Now, I do introduce hermeneutics into this session, which is a little bit of a therapy thing, but I do think it forms a good introduction to the idea of how we struggle in relationships. While we're influencing one person, they're influencing us at the same time. So we do the relationship exercise, and we even talk about the most difficult relationship as being the personal trainer, which is an exercise I've been using for years. It's very, very effective. And so, as well as hearing people struggle here, we do challenge them as well on the idea of challenges in life and saying, look, your choice here is to not allow that challenge to become a temptation, but to maintain it as a trial. And that idea of temptation or trial is really our choice. So we get this from Matthew 16, verse 13 onwards, which is this amazing scripture where Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say I am? So there's a lot in it, so I hope you get a lot from it. And really good to see you, you wonderful people. Thank you so much for coming. I really hope you're going to get something really worthwhile tonight. This is Transformed, and we'll first of all go through our 4 principles. And again, just to remind you, I know we've done this before, but just to remind you what these 4 guidelines help us do. We want to stay away from the medical model. We want to move towards a biblical understanding. And you'd be surprised how difficult that is, because the culture that we're living in is saturated in man's wisdom. It's saturated in the medical model. And where that influences you more than anywhere else is the way you think about yourself. That needs an overhaul, we need to overcome. And so these 4 ideas will tend to help us stay on that track. Whenever someone asks a question or whenever we discuss something, if I can see us veering back towards medical stuff, and don't forget, there's no harm in you interpreting and translating what I'm saying through a medical idea, because sometimes we can do nothing else, because that's our only understanding. But when we see a biblical understanding, you'll start to see how far away you've been dragged from biblical truth. So the first one is you'll never be asked what your problem is. And that is a big shock to the system to start with, because we're always labeling stuff, aren't we? We're always trying to give it a name, give it a condition, and Big Pharma says, I've got a pill for that, and off we go. Right? So the medical model starts with what? What proposition? If you go see the doctor, what's wrong with you? Right? It has to start there, because it doesn't function if there's nothing wrong with you. Right? But look at where it is as a starting point. Right? We want to avoid that. So you will not be asked what your problem is. If you want to share what's going on in your life, what difficulties you are, you're welcome to do that. But we won't ask you. In other words, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about problems. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about overcoming and being transformed. So, again, I want you to hold me to account on these things. You'll never be told what to do or what to stop doing. Again, we want to avoid instructive interaction. It's very simple, it's very easy, and it's very, it's not complicated. I could just stand here and say, right, you lot, stop this, don't do this, do more of this. I could say, take every thought captive, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right, and we're finished, right? But we don't want to do that. I will tell you what the Bible says about things, but I won't tell you personally what to do about it. Whatever you do or don't do is up to you. You're going to make those decisions. You will be able to go at your own pace in this group. I hope you can all see this screen. This is really important to me. I have it on my heart because in my own personal recovery, I know how long it took me to get out from underneath. It took years. I'm just talking about myself now. And so it's really important to me that we don't rush people through a process. And often, and I say this about churches generally, sometimes, they want to do a course. And it's 5 or 6 weeks, and they tick the box and they move on, right? This is tantamount to me getting on the bus and driving along and thinking we're doing great, and I look in the mirror and you're still at the bus stop because you never actually got on, right? We're here now for a year. We're committed to it. And so I know that is the kind of time scale I want to look at. When we're looking at making real progress, it's to say, I'm committed. And I just want you to be as committed as I am, right? So you will be able to go at your own pace. By the way, if you're on the WhatsApp group for Transformed, you will see a link to the Monday night online meeting. Anybody been to that, Clive? I know you were there. Right, so we've got 2 or 3 here who were there. I do want to encourage you to try it because, let's hear from somebody who was there. Good.
About it, I was just saying, on Wednesday night, I actually found I'm just writing down and really listening and soaking up and going, and I found I'm reflecting on it, or I was starting to convict me on things that we started talking about on Wednesday, and I feel like I was literally on Monday night waiting for Mark 7 to get on at 8 o'clock ready for the thing, because I literally just needed Monday night because I was able to get some clarity on some things that I've been stressing about, and so for me that's really calming, and just more personable and really being able to ask specific questions about things that you just want more understanding on. So just find it really important and valuable.
It's a relaxed atmosphere. We can go into things in more detail. Yeah. Obviously, I've got a lot to get through on a night like this. So I have to keep plodding on. But on Monday night, it feels like a bit more personal. So I do encourage you, if you want to be part of that, all you have to do is get on the WhatsApp group and click the link. You just have to have Zoom, the old Zoom.
I normally pick up new concepts fairly quickly.
Sure.
However, not the movement away from the medical model.
Right.
Which is what you're suggesting we look at. And I'm finding it more difficult than I thought I would do.
Yes.
Because, like us all, it's the medical model, the medical profession. We're brought up in it. We've all got GPs. Most of us have been in hospital at some point in our lives. Some of us have been inpatient for one reason or another. But it's slowly clicking.
Mm-hmm.
Before you go into any of the details, it's slowly clicking for me that this is not a medical model.
Right.
And that's a step.
Yes. Right. It's more tricky than you think, right? And thank you so much for saying that. And, you're talking about a man of experience saying, it's taking me a while to get hold of this. And I want you to take that seriously, right? Don't think that you've got this because you get a bit of information. It's our whole way of thinking that's moved away from the Bible. So thank you for that. Anybody else want to say anything?
It's just quickly, really. I
was encouraged by, I think it was Darren that posted something about
Yes.
the video, and I've shared that on
That was good, wasn't it?
and I've actually baptised someone today.
Wonderful.
Through that.
Yes. So good.
I've been witnessing for 10 years too. And led to the Lord last week after this thing got posted, and then sent that to her. And I've actually baptised her today.
Isn't that great?
In the bathtub.
Well, let's be encouraged.
About this thing, to encourage people. I mean, you can't say blew your mind, it's not a thing, but it really did something to me.
Yes.
It really touched a lot of trauma in my life as well. Something so simple, but I found it profound. You know, I sent it to about 30 people.
Yeah.
And it's like, some of them wasn't even believers, and I think, yeah.
It's lovely.
It really touched them, and that's what it's about. This really here, this transformation. But while I'm here, what I'm saying about getting on the bus?
Yes.
Do we get off the bus? Do you know what?
It's a journey, right? Yeah.
That's what, do we get off the bus?
Yeah. No, it's a journey. It's giving people enough time and enough encouragement to actually get them on the bus is the problem. Thank you so much for that. Just again, to make this clear, forgive me if you've heard this too many times, but I'm not talking about medicine here. Medicine is fantastic, right? Amazing, clever people doing wonderful things. The distinction we make is the same one that Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, made. In other words, if you can see it under a microscope, then it's medical, right? Whether it's a virus, a broken bone, bacteria, whatever like that. But when they've delved into the what Kant calls the business of the mind, that's when they make a misstep. When you can't see anything under a microscope, but they still give you a pill for it anyway, right? So make a distinction here. We're not talking about medicine, we're talking about the medical model, which is basically what the Bible calls man's wisdom. Number 4. You will be offered a Bible-based method of growth. Are we agreed on this? Would you say it's been Bible-based so far? Right? Again, we want to be held accountable to that. As Andy prayed earlier, it's not my voice we want, it's God's word that we want. It brings life. So, we're just coming towards the end of the module 1. And it's important that we understand there are 4 modules in here. And we're talking about buying or building a home. That's our metaphor. And it's a wonderful metaphor. Why? Because Jesus used it in Matthew 7. And if you have a look at Matthew 7, verse 24, you'll see how he uses this wonderful metaphor where he talks about the house being your life, and he talks about the rock that it's built on as the Word of God. That's what he's meaning. And so what we're talking about doing is moving from the house or lifestyle that we're living in at the moment, whatever your issue is, and building or buying a new home in a different location. So that's our metaphor. And our first module is all about preparation. In other words, we're not talking about doing anything yet. It's quite surprising because I know a lot of urgent issues and a lot of difficult problems. People want you to run at things and get things done, or even maybe start with behavior. We finish with behavior. We don't start with it. Behavior is at the end of what we do, not at the beginning. Right? I want to get that point across because we want to get as far from psychology as we can. Right? This is not medical. So the 3 preparation questions here are cost, location, and design. And those are the 3 questions I believe you would be asking if you were buying a home today. Those are the 3 big ones. And last week, we looked at cost, didn't we? I put a few questions out there to start talking about if you're going to buy a new home, you can't just decide to do this without thinking about the cost. What does Jesus say about this? He says, if any of you wants to build a tower, don't you first sit down and count the cost? right? Otherwise you'll be mocked and people say, well, this man started building but he can't finish, right? We want to finish. So we have to count the cost. And cost is different for everybody. Everybody will be looking at cost differently. Now, I don't know if you've worked this out yet, but one of the things that came to me as we were doing the teaching, I think we said this on Monday night, which, funnily enough, it hadn't occurred to me before. But you know, generally when we buy a new home or when we move into a new home, we generally get rid of the old one. Some people can, you know, maybe afford to buy more than one home. But most of us, if we move from one place, the cost of moving to the new place is the old place. Is that right? Yeah. I hope you get that. So I've put that up here to help you think about cost. As we move on from this question, I want to make sure that you've studied it properly and that you're well aware of what the cost will be to you. So I want to say that the cost of the new house is the old house. In other words, the cost of living a different life is to stop living this life. So, now we're going to look at location, which is a different question. All right? But the idea of cost here, I just want to say something else about it because I want you to make this distinction. Now, this may be perfectly true or it may be a little bit true. It depends on your situation. But if you think of the old house as flesh, driven by flesh, built by fleshly ideas, built by worldly ideas, and the new house as spirit, this is the main idea. This is what being transformed actually means. You know that we've got our banner headline, which is Romans 12, verse 2. You've got to know it by now, right? Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's our banner headline. We've got 2 Corinthians, I believe it's 3:18, that also gets more specific there when it talks about us all with unveiled faces. It's a reference to Moses, who had to have his face veiled. But in the new covenant, we all, it says, with unveiled faces are being transformed into the image of Christ. So that's what transformed actually means. It means you're becoming more Christ-like. And where does that start? Between your ears.
So I remember you saying, what you conform to shapes you. So when you conform, that's where the transformation.
So what's being said here is the idea of what does conform mean? It means shaping yourself to the pattern of this world. And that's where medical models and things like that come in, is you conform to it. And that's our big mistake. So, is anyone getting this idea? I know that it's an extreme idea, but certainly in my own case, it applies in as much as when before I knew Christ, before I was a Christian, my life, like the younger son in Luke 15 and the Prodigal, my life was a disaster, basically. And I realize now, I look back now, and it's very clear to me that the reason it's a disaster is because all my decisions were based in the flesh. And when you do these things, you're trying to make a good thing happen, but you're limited because it's all fleshly. Yes. And Galatians 5:17 helps us understand that anything driven by the flesh will have a fleshly outcome, and anything driven by the Spirit will have a spiritual outcome, and you cannot ever mix them. So if you've been living here, and we've got to understand, even if you have been living here, it can look very good. What you do, you can be as good as you like, you can be really helpful. You can be sacrificial. You can do all kinds of things, but they're limited by the flesh. And that's why it's not satisfying. That's why we don't overcome. It's why we don't make progress. Jesus put it this way. He said, don't be like that guy who prays on the street corner. Very wordy prayers, right? Basically, he tells you this. He says, he's already had his reward. He doesn't say there is no reward. He says he's already had it. Why? Because it's a fleshly motivation, and people listening to him is his reward. It's in the flesh, right? Jesus goes on to say, when you pray, go to your room and close the door. And then your Father who sees what you do in secret will reward you in secret. That's when you've moved from here to here. And the difficulty with it is the same difficulty we all have, is that this, nobody sees. This is showing everybody. This is appearance, this is reality. And to move from one to the other is such a commitment because no one sees it. It's not impressive. It's in secret. So.
But can I just ask something? So if you're moving from the flesh to the spirit, you're becoming more Christ-like. Will people see that anyway? You're becoming more Christ-like.
They will see eventually what you're doing. Some will take tremendous advantage of it. Right? But if you, obviously you're not doing it for that reason, if you're doing it in the spirit, right? But yes, absolutely. Eventually, I mean, I work, I'm a therapist. I work in addiction and recovery with a lot of secular clients as well as church and Christian clients. And one of the biggest hurdles that we have to get over is the idea of what do the family think? Right? Like, they want to see results because they want the family to approve of them because they feel so bad. And often they'll want to push ahead too quickly because they want to get this horrible weight of guilt and shame off their shoulders. And they think if they get a lot of approval from the family, they can let that go. And it doesn't work like that. Right? So I take your point, and I think that eventually, yes, the truth will out and people will see, and not when you start. Not when you start. Being misunderstood is a big part of this, right? To let go of control of others. We're going to talk about boundaries tonight, and we'll get to this. So, I just want to give you this scripture. I know I gave it you last week, but it's really important. That 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be misled. Whether we call it ego, or whether we call it pride, or just overconfidence, whatever you want to call it, do not think that you can stay in the old house and get the new results. Do not think that you can keep the same company or live in the same neighborhood, metaphorically speaking, and you'll be safe because you're okay. The Bible tells you, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. And we're going to talk a lot about relationships tonight. We're going to talk about influence and some of the concepts that we can use. So we're going to do an exercise. And I don't know whether you like exercises, but I can see notepads and pens. That's fantastic. Those of you who haven't got them, don't worry. But I want you to try this exercise because tonight we're going to talk about location. And metaphorically speaking, what that means is it means who are you spending time with? If you think about the old house, the way you've been living, you've been spending time with people, we call them your neighbors in that neighborhood. We're talking now about making a decision to move. I can't tell you how many times I've got a client at the moment who's a classic example of this. He's a drinker and he's a drug taker and he's cleaning up his act. And what he's facing now, what he's dealing with after a few weeks of working and talking about lifestyle and so on, he's facing the idea that everybody he knows is a drinker. He doesn't know anybody else. And this is tough, right? When you're thinking about moving home, you're saying, well, I'm going to move to somewhere I don't know anybody. Not quite, but it can be severe like that. If some of you are facing these issues, you've got to take that, because this is where location and cost kind of blend a little bit, right? Because he's saying, well, I've just realizing that everybody I know is a drinking buddy. That's all they are. I thought these were my friends. But actually, since I stopped drinking and I don't go to the pub anymore and I don't buy the drugs with them, they've never rang me, they've never texted me, no one's ever even bothered with me. And that's a tough thing to face, right? But again, you're thinking about being transformed. And that's part of the cost. So relationship exercise, I want you to consider, because I'm not telling you what to do, right? I want you to consider writing down the names of people that you see every week. I'm not talking about, once a blue moon, but just think about the important people in your life. It can include family. It should include family. All right? So write down those names if you want to do this exercise. And once you've got the names, okay, don't write down a name of somebody you only saw, twice a year or something. Not so important. But people that you're, in terms of our house metaphor, these are people that you're actually living next to. These are your neighbours. All right?
Sorry, can that include people from work as well?
Of course it can. Of course it can. And it brings a special problem, as do family. Because you can't always choose who you work with. Yeah. And you definitely can't choose your family. But you can choose your friends. I don't know if we do. Have we got pens and paper? And is there... Anybody got a pen and a...
I'll put it on the notes before that I can already.
Yeah, but I just wanted to take a picture.
Yeah. This is a little exercise. You can do it any time. I'm really wanting to go through how to do the exercise, because there's a little part of it that you may not have thought of. Because when we write down the names, and again, you don't need to share this with anybody, this is just for you, right? When you write down the names, I want you to then score the relationships. Now, before you do that, I want you to understand a very important difference between what we might call a psychology test here. What do you think of these people? And what we're going to do, there's a bit of a difference. And it's an important difference. Because the way I want you to score these relationships is to score them between 0 and 10. Okay? Now, 5, I want you to consider neutral. In other words, 5 is neither good nor bad. 5 is neutral. So from 5 to 10, this is positive. From 0 to 5 is more negative, right? And the way you score it is important, because it's how do you think and feel about yourself after you've been with these people. Right? That's the important difference. It's not how you feel about the people, because blaming someone, turning yourself into some kind of victim, that's not helpful. That doesn't overcome. That's not spiritual progress. But learning, how do you feel about yourself after you've been around them? That's a trickier question and much more helpful.
Especially when you live with sometimes not the answer to what you
No. And remember, we're not going to tell you what to do and what not to do. It's up to you what you do about these things. But I'm giving you this exercise as a way of understanding the old house. This is where you're living. And if you need to do something about that, only you are going to do it. But through Christ, all things are possible, right? So, take your time. You can be from 0 to 5, or it can be between 5 and 10. And then, once we got those scores, or we got some idea, and it's something you can do later on, you can develop it. The idea that, for instance, some relationships are very, very difficult, right? And I would take you through an exercise, which we may or may not do tonight, where I actually want you to be in a difficult relationship. In other words, I want you to use the most difficult relationship, right? Because that's where the most growth will come from, often, right? So it's not just about leaving it because it doesn't feel good, right? Good point. So when we score these things, right, we've got to be careful, because sometimes if you've got that overburdening sense of responsibility for others, then you'll often feel good because you think you've helped someone, for instance. So there's part of the complication, right? But we don't want to be like the older brother in Luke 15, who appears spiritual, but he isn't, right? So the adjustments are, I'll give you a general idea. Anyone who's scoring between 0 and 2, I would say we need to do something serious about that, right? Anyone who's scoring between 8 and 10, we need to develop that relationship, spend more time with them, right? Because these are people who are helping you. These are people who are building up your confidence, your esteem, and so on. But we're not talking about people who are just, blowing smoke. You have to understand the difference.
Yeah. Every person of faith that I'm around elevates me.
Right?
Elevates me.
There you go. Well, these are personal decisions, right? But just let me say something here about a little exercise like this. When we talk in terms of neuroscience, or what certainly a biblical view, when you do an exercise like this, you're doing more than just the practice of the exercise. That's got a practical value, particularly if you change things. But there's another side to this. Whenever you do something that is good for you, that is helpful, you're giving a message to your brain, to your flesh, right? That sees everything you do, watches, listens, everything that you do, and learns from it. And that message you're giving is what we would call valuable cargo. That's a psychiatric term. I'm just slipping back into the medical stuff for a second. It's a Gestalt idea in terms of therapy. In other words, if I was working with a secular client, I'm not going to talk biblically to them, I would say you are the captain of the good ship, you. Yeah. Right? But you're also the crew, you're also the ship, and you're also the cargo. Because in Gestalt, you're everything, right? And when you give a good message to your brain, what you're saying is, this is valuable cargo. And what that does to your flesh is it says, it's important that we get to the destination because the cargo is valuable. When you do something that pulls down your esteem and your self-worth, which is what we're talking about with this relationship exercise, that's what can happen. You're giving a message to your brain that says, this cargo is not really worth anything. So really, what does it matter if we get to the destination? It's not really worth anything. Do you see the difference? Right?
Do you think on the 12-step program, that step 7, making amends? So you can make an amends wherever possible. Sometimes amends are never made just after I said that. It's a bit of a small sometimes.
Well, the real amends steps are 8 and 9, but you're basically starting. The difficulty I find with that sort of approach sometimes is that people want to do step 1, step 8, step 9. You know what I mean? They want to pick. Yeah, they want to cherry pick. They want to cherry pick the steps, and generally speaking, it's because they want to get that weight of guilt off their shoulders, right? But if you try and make amends and you're not ready to do it, you're still living in the old house, then you've got a fleshly motivation, you're going to get a fleshly outcome. right? So that's why I say take your time. That's why I say processing helps. One of the great things about AA and about the fellowships like that, I think, my opinion, is that they give you time.
Yes.
You can unfreeze in a meeting like that, and I know because I did it.
Yeah.
Right? You can take years.
It was even the anyway, actually.
So I think that's really valuable, and that's what we try and replicate in something like this. Is to say, let's not rush you through step one, step two. I can give you all the advice, but can you really follow it? Are you ready to follow it? Well,
It's behavioral change over
it takes time, right? Be patient with yourself. A relationship exercise like this can be something simply to just to meditate on, just to think about, right? For instance, you're with family members. Those relationships can be extremely problematic, and you can't choose them. But you can manage yourself inside those boundaries and inside that relationship. You do something, right? So there's an exercise. Now, just to give you an idea that I'm not simply trying to get you to push certain people out and bring certain people in. It's not as simple as that. I want you to think about if you've ever had a personal trainer.
Yes, a few.
Right? A few. You've tried that one. Think about a personal trainer, right? Most of you have not had one, but think about what that is, really. It's really somebody that you pay to come and give you pain. Right? You're saying, I'll pay you, come and hurt me. Right? It's a difficult relationship, isn't it? Because what they're doing is they're just pushing you, and you're paying them for the privilege. Right? I want you to think for a moment about your most difficult relationship. Everybody's got one. May not be your wife or your husband, but often it is. Right? Again, you don't have to share this with anybody. So I want you to think about it, because it's really helping you understand the nature of this exercise. You see, I want you to think of your most difficult relationship as a personal trainer.
What if it's difficult and you're in no position to obviously drop them off your relationship list?
Exactly. And
Difficult one for me. I'm struggling with a certain relationship, but unfortunately I keep going back because
yes.
unfortunately I can't go.
Yes, I understand.
Even though we're in a bad relationship. Not a relationship as like boyfriend, not in like talking like a family member. But even though I'm struggling deep down inside, I can't turn back and play. So
Yes.
until he changes, then obviously I'm still going off.
Yes. And this is why we take our time. This is why we don't be pushy around what you should or shouldn't do about something. I want you to think of that relationship as your personal trainer, right? Because you're saying, I'm not going to get out of it. I'm not going to leave, right? So when that person interacts with you, I want you to consider as if that person is saying, give me 10 more repeats, right? Especially when it becomes problematic or they're manipulative or coercive or controlling or whatever it is they're doing that's wrong, that's out of the spirit, it's clearly fleshly, right? I'm not saying leave it. In fact, I'm saying that we talk about these difficult relationships as a personal trainer because this is where most of the growth will come from. If you understand this as a principle, I would put it this way. Your growth is going to come from your difficulties, right? Sometimes in the Bible, it's called the refiner's fire. Fire burns, right? It hurts. Crosses are heavy, okay? But the idea, we don't run away from pain, particularly not suffering. The difficulty with suffering is we either turn it into a temptation or we turn it into a trial. And that's our choice. Right? That's what James talks about, right? If we turn it into a temptation, then we become a victim, right? If we turn it into a trial, then we become an overcomer. And that's not the same as leaving the relationship or saying, you know, I'm going to give up on this one. It's saying, I can grow in this difficulty. Right?
So the relationships are just for growth?
Just for growth?
Yeah.
No, that's not what...
Manipulative and coercive, and that's not how people deal with it.
No, and you may choose to leave it. Right? What I'm saying is that don't just think of this exercise as a way of saying, right, they're out, they're in. There's more. It's more complicated than that. Some things are worth working on, and some things you can't get out of. Some things you can't get out of.
If it was a relationship, obviously, in it, trust me, but
I know.
when it's a family,
I know. I know.
it's a bit difficult.
It's more than difficult. You can't choose family. I absolutely understand.
And it's more than at the end of the day, that's
Yes.
walk away, it's difficult.
And I'm not asking you to do that, and I wouldn't, okay? That'll be your choice.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that the more difficult the relationship, the greater potential for your growth.
Yeah.
To get a diamond, you have to apply extreme pressure.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I'm worried in it, but
Yes, you're managing it. Yeah.
it can be a time when I don't see him for a few days, and then within 5 minutes, it's like he's gone. But unfortunately, we're seeing whether that's what we're doing it.
Yes.
We would say at the moment that's one of my main things that's dragging me down at the minute.
Let's drag it.
Everything, it's dragging me down at the minute.
Yes.
That's why a lot of my problems come from relationship with family members and now it's gone from family members to work colleagues.
And by the way, so does everybody else. Right? You're not on your own with that one.
Oh, no,
Right?
on my own, but then you can't just, when you say, you know, get rid of the ones that are not working out, that's the question.
No, hang on. Let's not misinterpret, right? I'm not saying get rid of, right? I'm saying that if you're talking about things like friends, right, then you can choose, depending on what the score is, you can choose what to do with that, right? But the easiest thing is to jump to that conclusion that we just say, well, we either cut it off or, you know, but you can't always do that, and neither should you always do that, right? The greater the difficulty, the greater the potential for growth. What you've got to be careful of is that in that relationship, you don't become a victim, right? It's unbelievably difficult in certain circumstances, but we're going to look at a thing called hermeneutics in a minute. Sounds a bit complicated, but I'm going to explain it to you. And it's a way of avoiding this idea of victimhood and blame, which doesn't get us anywhere. Okay? So take that exercise, think about it, right?
Before you, how do we mark?
One second, Clem.
Just, I'm not quite clear on number 3. What would you like us to put down?
No, that's your choice.
Right.
The adjustment is your choice. What you do about it.
It's not a marker, it's not a number 2, a score.
You can score it, and then what you do about that score is up to you. But sometimes I've had people do this exercise and not realize how low someone scores. Right? It's like news to you to even look at this. Okay? But what you do about it is up to you.
The other question is, you said this already, but I missed it. Scoring a number 2, 5 in the middle, you say, and is 0 and 10 high or low, or 0?
So 0 is people who make you feel bad about you. 10 is people who make you feel good about you, but we're talking about the right reasons. Okay? But again, what you do about it is up to you. The most difficult relationship in your life can be the biggest growth for you, but you have to take the right attitude towards it.
Do you think recognising someone else's battle with mental health can be a big genius, because people struggle, don't they? I've got a personal person to me, who's got an extreme bipolar mindset. Up and down.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
And so,
Yeah.
to live with someone bipolar mindset, for them to be so good, and then to be so bad, in the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
It's so hard to deal with.
Yeah. There's no... there's no quick fixes on offer here. We're not going to try and solve people's life problems, with a quick fix. Yeah. Not at all. This suffering is genuine. It's real. We say, oh, it's in the flesh. That's not to belittle it. It's real. It hurts, right? And what's more, I'll guarantee you're going to get it wrong. You're a human being. You're not perfect. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to make some poor decisions sometimes, right? But the main issue is to realize that it's affecting you, right? In the way you meet that relationship. We'll talk about it in terms of hermeneutics here. You might have heard of Hermes. I think it's Roman rather than Greek, but it's a mythological character, the winged messenger. You see Interflora with the wings on the heels? Have you ever seen that one? Mythology is though he was the winged messenger. So hermeneutics is the study of relationships from a perspective of influence. And I want you to just take this idea in for a second. Because when you're in relationship with someone, and believe me, most of your issues in life are coming through relationships, right? When you're in relationship with someone, the idea of influence here is simultaneous. In other words, if you start thinking, this person's this kind of person, that's it's a judgment, it's a reasonable idea, but it's not taking into account the hermeneutics, right? If you think about what kind of a relationship what's going on here, you have to take into account what you're constructing between the two of you. Not what you're doing or what they're doing, but what you are doing together. You're making something.
You have to be accountable for it.
Accountability, of course, but it's easy to become a victim if you think of what they're like. Yeah. Right? That's a judgment. So, what do we gain from looking at something hermeneutically? Well, let's look at the problem first. The difficulty you have in relationships is, I'm speaking now, let me speak for a second as a marriage counsellor, as a couples counsellor. A lot of work I do is with couples, and a couple will sit down on a couch in front of me, and by the way, couples counselling used to be very well known as the most stressful form of counselling of all of them. Because two people used to sit on a couch and look at you as if to say, sort us out, the pressure was unbelievable, right? But we do it differently these days. We put them on two chairs facing each other. We don't have them facing the counsellor anymore. We have them facing each other. Why? Because we're trying to reconnect people, right? So when you're dealing with a couple, let me tell you what are the biggest difficulties, and some of you will identify with this completely. Let's say, I think we all understand the idea of baggage or luggage, don't we? That we've all come from a family that has a certain way of doing things. We bring that baggage with us into this relationship. And a lot of the struggle in a couple's relationship is that this person's trying to make this new family that you're forming like the old family that they come from. And the other one's trying to make it like their family. Not even trying to do it very strongly, but that's just what happens. Things are supposed to go this way. Things are supposed to go. Then you've got the problem of personal issues. And I want you to understand this hermeneutically. In other words, Let me give you the classic example. Not everybody's like this, but this is the way they teach you to do this. We talk about women nagging, and we talk about men withdrawing. Why? Because it's very typical of what might happen, right? So what happens in hermeneutics, you might say, if you're the bloke, you might say, well, she just never stops nagging me. Who you are in a relationship is what can change. And so the idea that the man might say, oh, she just never stops nagging. And the wife might say, well, I can't get close to him. He keeps withdrawing. He keeps moving away from me. We're emotionally distant. And those are two traits. But when you think of them happening simultaneously, then you start to get a clue of what goes wrong and becomes very difficult in a marriage or any other relationship. In a marriage, it's more intense. In other words, the more that she nags, the more he withdraws. And the more he withdraws, the more she nags. So you can see how it starts to strangulate. And what starts out as a little bit of a trait and a little bit of an idiosyncrasy becomes an obsession. So somebody, for instance, a wife who might just want to, get closer or sort things out, becomes a tremendous nag. And a husband who's quite affable and reasonably present in a relationship becomes completely isolated. By the time they get to the counsellor and sit on the couch and try and sort things out, this thing is strangulated into an impossible situation. Just think of it in terms of how things tighten. What starts out as a little trait, a little bit of baggage that you bring, becomes worse and worse and worse and worse because it's happening simultaneously. You're reacting to each other. So this is why we say, when you're looking at difficult relationships, try to avoid this idea of being the victim in it. Right? Try to avoid the idea that this is how they are. Right? Because often what you'll find is that a person will be like that around you, but they won't be like that around someone else. Why are they different? They haven't. Have they just changed? No, they're in a different relationship. Does that make sense? Right? And you may have noticed this in yourself. You might realize that you're a different person when you're with different people, because it brings out a different side of you, and this is a deeper understanding of relationship. Okay? Now, what happens when we do this inner discipling we're talking about? Because the first relationship you need to work on is the relationship with yourself. And that's why we talk about the medical model so much, because that's how much it's affected, is in that first relationship. Right? Once you understand yourself as multifaceted, in other words, you don't think of yourself as a single thing, but you think of yourself as having both the spirit and the flesh simultaneously, right? Then you've got a life, you've got a daytime, you've got an experience where either your flesh is running your day or your spirit. One or the other. And they don't mix. They don't mix, right? So in working on your relationship with yourself, what you're doing is you're coming from a Christ-minded position, talking to your fleshly parts. And what is that? That's exactly what Jesus did. He worked with disciples. And that's what you do when you are transformed. The transformation comes when you work on your relationship with yourself. Let me promise you this, when you get your relationship with yourself much better, your relationship with others will improve. Because you will be running your show, your life, much more than you are now in the old house. In the new house, your spirit will be running the show much better. If you want scripture on this, I would look at Matthew 16. This is an incredible moment in scripture. I urge you to study it and make sure that you're not taking this from me, but you read it for yourself, okay? In Matthew 16, I think it's around about verse 17, it starts, it's this incredible moment. Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" He's asking the disciples now, right? And this is, you can interpret this as you asking your own flesh, you starting to realize your own flesh, which we're going to talk about in the second half, and asking people, who do you think I am? When you ask yourself, right? He turns to the disciples, he says, who do people say I am? And he says, oh, some disciples said Elisha, some people said, you're a great prophet or whatever. And he says, yes, but who do you say I am? And then Peter comes out with this incredible thing. He says, you are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. Jesus, his reaction is noteworthy. He says, bless you, Simon, son of Jonah. He said, because these words didn't come from you. They came from my Father. What's he saying there? He's saying that God is speaking through Peter. It's Spirit-driven. He's in the Spirit. That's what we're talking about. That's what transformation is. Study it for yourself. Jesus says, bless you. These words didn't come from you. They came from my Father. Do you see the point? What it's saying is this. It's when you think like God would think. When you talk what God says. You're indistinguishable from God. I'm not saying you become God. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying you can't distinguish between you and God because you're doing what God would do. But what happens when we get to verse 21? It says, from this time, Jesus began to explain how he must go to Jerusalem and be crucified. And Peter pulls him to one side. And he says, hang on a minute, Lord, no. We'll never let that happen to you. I don't know if he's full of pride because he's just been blessed by Jesus or something, but it says he began to rebuke him. And what does Jesus do? He said, get behind me, Satan. So as far as we know, in just a few minutes, Peter's gone from being godlike to being Satan-like. And that is the human condition. That's what we're living with. Right? Because if it's not God speaking, it's our flesh. This is profound, isn't it? I know it's challenging, right? But that's in the Bible. You study it for yourself and see what you make of it. Right? Because we can do both. We can do either.
What was that, sorry?
What the scripture?
Yeah.
It's Matthew 16, and I think it's from verse 17 to verse 21.
13 and 15. 13 and 15 says it quotes.
Yeah. You'll see all that passage. Start from where he says, Jesus said, who do people say I am? All right? Okay, let's have a break now. And we'll come back to this. We're going to talk about boundaries. Over 10 minutes. Let's make it 5. So that's the first half, and we're talking about location, which is all about your relationships, reviewing them. Who are my neighbors? Which relationships do I want to develop? Which ones do I want to do less of? Taking charge of your life. This is what the first half has been about. Now, in the second half, we're talking about boundaries. Again, really important. And there's a lot to boundaries, but I like to keep it really simple at this stage. I simply talk about a boundary fence and saying, look, it's either too close or too far away from your house. In other words, you review every relationship and you ask yourself, am I doing things for this person that they should be doing for themselves? Or am I allowing them to do things for me that I should be doing for myself? This leads us into the observer position and the idea of stepping aside from yourself, as in Luke 15, the prodigal, when it says, and he turned again to himself. This is the idea of the observer position, which goes along with the idea of naming your first part. In other words, you're starting to look at yourself when you're not entirely in charge of yourself. And if you're used to the medical view, and this is new to you and you haven't considered it, this really is going to be a challenge for you. So I really want to encourage you to take your time with this. It's very different to look at things the way God designed you, as opposed to the way medical science has told you to think about yourself. So again, take your time with that. We then go into Luke 15 and the prodigal. And I would say, for me, in the area that I work in, this is probably certainly one of the most important, if not the most important story that Jesus tells. In fact, Charles Dickens called it the greatest short story ever told. And I always say, look, there's everything you need to know in that story about addiction, reverse addiction, family dysfunction, rock bottoms, recovery. It's all in there if you look for it. And amazingly, it's not even the most important part of the story. It's almost like a subtext, but trust me, it's all in there. So there we are. I hope you get so much from this, and I'll see you at the end. So I'm going to talk briefly about boundaries. Boundaries are hugely important. And when we use the metaphor of a building, I want you to understand that every boundary that you have around this new house is personal to somebody. I want you to think of it that way. In other words, if you imagine this house that you're going to buy or you're going to move into, and it's got a garden fence around it or a wall around it, every wall that it has, I want you to think of it as a personal boundary with someone. Don't just think of it as a fence. Think of it in personal terms. In other words, that fence at the back there is my boundary with him or her or them. Right? Because working with boundaries is hugely helpful to making decisions around relationships and so on. So when I talk about boundaries, I try and keep it really simple. And remember, you're going to make the decision what you do about these things. But initially, it's just an exercise, right? And the way you do the exercise or the way you think about boundaries is very simple. It's just like this. You have a fence that demarcates the end of your property and the start of somebody else's, right? That's what a boundary is, okay? Now, the way we think about that metaphorically in terms of our model is in terms of responsibility. So think of lawn on your side of the fence and lawn on their side of the fence. Who cuts that lawn is who's responsible. Does that make sense? Simple, right? Here's the problem. Sometimes your fence is not in the right place. It should be right in between your property and someone else's, shouldn't it? Right? So the only two issues that we can have with boundaries is that your fence is too close to your house or it's too far away. That's how simple I want you to keep it. Just because this is a way of thinking about this, okay? So what's the implications? What are the consequences? Well, imagine if you had your fence too close to your own house. What would that mean? Think in terms of lawn. You're not cutting your own lawn, right? You're asking someone else to cut your lawn. Because the fence is too close. So your lawn, do you get the idea? Right. What happens if your fence is too far from your house? You're cutting someone else's lawn. It's as simple as that. Now, relationships are very complicated, so we have to have a simple idea. And this is about as simple as it gets. If your fence is too close to your house, you're asking someone else to mow your lawn. What does that mean? It means you're expecting someone else to be responsible for stuff you should be doing. Simple as that. Right? And that, like any other form of training, and remember, we're talking about your flesh now, we're talking about your brain. What does it do? Well, it's brilliant at learning. It's brilliant at being trained. It loves it. And it loves to regurgitate that training. So if you've been brought up, and we're talking about baggage again, aren't we? If you've been brought up in a way where you have been trained to expect people to do things for you that actually are your responsibility, then you have to think about where you're putting that fence. And moving that fence out is painful because it means you're going to have to start cutting your own lawn. Oh, yes. If you start pushing your fence too far out, this is the first issue that we're looking at, right? Is I'm now cutting someone else's lawn. In other words, I'm now doing things for other people that they should be doing for themselves. And if that becomes trained into me, if that becomes a natural, apparently natural idea, it's just how I am, well, you weren't born that way, right? So when we think about fences being too close or too far, I want you to understand that this is addiction and reverse addiction. Addiction and reverse addiction. I want you to think of it as simple and powerful like that, so that if your fence, can you see which one is which? Yeah. Right? If your fence is too far from your house, which one is that? Yes. No. Yeah. If your fence is too far, you're reversed. Right? Did I hear you wrong? Yeah. Sorry. When your fence is too far, it's reversed because you're feeling a burden of responsibility for others. Yeah. Right?
That's what we've just been talking about.
Exactly.
I learned this on your last course.
Exactly. And if your fence is too close, that's the addict side, because you're expecting somebody else is supposed to be doing this for me and they're not doing it, right? So I'm going to get lost in drugs and whatever else, right? Because it's not happening.
Do you think even though some people's mindset, you'll just do it, eventually you'll feel a burden?
What you're talking about is isolation, which I think is a separate issue. I think here we're looking just at the simple idea of boundary fence, right? I understand what you're saying, that if you become isolated, then you've got a whole different set of problems, right? But the idea of expectation. Now, we say in therapy, expectation changes experience. If I think it's going to rain tomorrow, I wear appropriate clothes and I have a different experience, right?
Isolation being one of the things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a factor, right? But I just want you to think, on top of the relationship exercise, also think in terms of boundaries. Because usually when you're critiquing a relationship or you're looking at the score that you give a relationship, you're also looking at where the boundary fence is. What can be problematic in a relationship is getting that boundary fence in the wrong place. And with a lot of you, it will be very obvious to you if you look at it. In other words, you won't be generally having your fence too far away from this side of the house, but actually too close from this side of the house. It will be a theme. And remember, we'll go into this more as we do the course, but remember that all addiction is an escape from reverse addiction. Right? It's escaping that burden and becoming utterly selfish. So just take on board this idea of boundaries. I'm going to move on because I want to cover something else tonight. But just take on board. We'll probably cover it again. This is all in the context of location. You understand? We're talking about where are we wanting to move to? Have we got to change our neighbourhood? Are we just going to move down the street? Or are we going to move to a different town altogether? Metaphorically speaking. What we were saying before, the first relationship to develop is the one with yourself. And if you're thinking too medically and you're thinking of yourself as a single object, then you won't be working on that relationship. But as soon as you enter a biblical view of yourself, which neuroscience, by the way, is now proving to be correct, perfectly normal, there's It's not an illness. It's not a condition. It is normal. When you say, I'm in two minds about that, that's a normal experience. When you say, I don't know what came over me, that's the human condition. What came over you was your flesh, right? So you have this potential, and you can see now how difficult it is to get away from the medical model, because a lot of you are just balking at this idea. Hang on a second. You're telling me that I'm going strange upstairs? No, I'm saying it's normal. And the Bible's been talking about it all along. And the moment you start to deal with it, the moment you start to take this seriously, that's when you start to overcome. Because you can start to disciple those parts of you. Now, we talked last week, I asked you to name a part of you. And everybody knows at least one part of them. Everybody does. Right? You can all go to it. And it's not easy to name, but we talk about naming to separate, right? We know very little about the disciples mostly, but we know the names, and the names are not Jesus. So this idea of mistaking Jesus for the disciples, we got to watch that, right? It's unmistakable in the Bible, but you will often mistake it in your life. Sometimes you'll think, and you'll even say to people, oh, you know what I'm like. It's just how I am. You know what it's like. But you weren't born that way. That is what we call a soft triggering, right? And in therapy, we call it unblending. Unblending. Separating, in a biblical sense, your flesh from your spirit. In a therapy sense, your mind from your brain. Your mind is the front room. Your brain is the back room. Keep it as simple as that. All right? So your mind, in where your spirit resides, basically has a spiritual motivation. But your brain does not. Right? Your brain does not know what spiritual is. If you want the scripture on this, have a look at Romans 8, verse 7. Because there's a key scripture here to really understanding this. Because you need to know the limits of your flesh. If you don't, you'll expect too much of it. Right? Anybody want to read Romans 8, 7 out?
So if the mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God, it does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so.
So there's this thing in the tail, right? Nor can it do so. He's telling you that it's not capable of doing it. It's no good trying to persuade your flesh to become more spiritual. That doesn't work, right? It's hostile to God. It's opposed to your spirit, and it needs to be discipled. Whenever you look at Jesus and the disciples, remember that this was the spirit approaching the flesh. All the disciples were trying to get on with their lives in a fleshly way. Remember? I've talked about this before, but I know it's a difficult thing to realize we're going to take this whole model and reproduce it internally. Do what Jesus did. When you look at the disciples, they had different attitudes towards life, but it was always fleshly. Remember that they were occupied by the Romans. They were oppressed by the church. The church was a rip-off. Everybody knew this. Yeah, everybody know about the 400 silent years. You've heard of that? This is the time between the Old Testament and New Testament. God said nothing for 400 years. Imagine how corrupt the church became in 400 years. Right? It was a rip-off. So they were oppressed by the church and they were traumatized by the Romans. So they were all trying to get on with their lives. And if you look at fishermen, they were saying, forget the Romans, you just get on with your life as best you can, right? That was Peter's idea, right? Basically his attitude. If you look at Levi, who became Matthew, he was a tax collector. He said, no, you've got to join the Romans. You've got to make it work, right? If you can't beat them, join them, right? And then you got the sons of thunder, haven't you? Right? Who wanted to kill the Romans. I don't know if you know about all this, but study it for yourself, right? I urge you to study everything you can read about discipleship, because you'll see all those attitudes existed in the disciples. And all of those attitudes exist in your flesh. And you will start to recognize them. The more you start to realize about your parts, the more you will get that they are disciples. And that they will listen to the voice of Christ within you. Because the Bible promises you everybody listens to the voice of Christ. So we call this unblending, and it's hard to do if you've been saturated in the medical model. And the first step of unblending is name that part. Right? You all have a part of you that you recognize, and you either hate it, or you're ashamed about it, or you wish it would go away, or you try and avoid it, or pretend it doesn't exist. But it's there. Right? And so do I. You don't have to show anyone this, you don't have to share it with anyone, but if you give it a name, that name has to be different to your name, because this is what creates the observer position. When you are triggered, as we see lots of examples in the Bible about the disciples taking over, and by the way, every time they took over, it was a disaster. Read it for yourself, okay? When your flesh takes over, it's also a disaster. Same thing, all right? So when you name it, you take this observer position. In other words, you step aside and you watch yourself. Now, if you want a great example of this, have a look at Luke 15 and verse 17. I talked about this last week. It's one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It's the prodigal son. And there's this incredible moment. We talked about this on Monday night, didn't we? Right? This incredible moment where it says, in some versions, it just says, when he came to his senses. But there's much deeper than that. And if you look at what versions did we look at? The Wycliffe version said, and he turned again to himself. Wow. That's a bit more like it. That's a rock bottom. That's the observer position. When you turn and face yourself, that is unblended. That is the observer position. Now, am I making sense here? Yeah. Right? Look it up for yourself. And while you're doing it, look at that whole prodigal story and look at from verse 11 to verse 17. Every decision he makes is a disaster because he's in the flesh. But from verse 17 to verse 32, every decision he makes is perfect because he's in the Spirit. That's what we're headed for. That's what transformed means. So I want to just finish here by asking you a few more questions. And again, look, take your time with this. If you've been saturated in the medical model, believe me, this is going to be difficult for you. All right? So start asking yourself a few questions about this part. If you've named this part, just give it a different name to you. If it, don't give it a trait name. You can if you want, but it's not the best. Like if I say, my name's Dave, and I say, right, I've got angry Dave. I've got angry Dave. That's fair enough, but I can do a bit better than that, right? Because I can ask myself, how old is my disciple or my part, right? If angry Dave was constructed when I was 9 years of age, because my dad left or because something happened, well then I want a name that I was called as a 9-year-old. What did my school friends call me? What was my nickname? Separate yourself with that name. If you've got a photograph of yourself at that age when you believe your part was constructed, remember, parts are constructed through trauma. It's when the bad things happen that your brain creates another disciple. So, if you have a fair idea, and believe me, this is not psychiatry. We don't need the exact dates. We don't need the exact things. Doesn't matter, right? That's not how biblical things work. So, you've got a reasonable idea of when this part was constructed, then that's the age. And it's important. Why? Because you need to talk to that part in an age-appropriate way. If the part is 7 years of age, you don't talk to it like an adult. You disciple it in basically where it is. And we're going to learn how to do this, right? So when was it constructed is a question. Again, it's important that you don't have to answer it perfectly. You don't have to know exactly everything that happened, but sometimes you do have a fair idea. right? Because things are traumatic in life. And that's life, right? John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble. Guaranteed. Jesus guaranteed it, right? So how old is my disciple? When was he or it or she constructed? Just interesting questions, right? To get you to separate, to unblend, and to start seeing. Because when that part shows up, it will show up the same way every time. It'll be the same. It might not look like the same situation, but it will be. There'll be something similar, and it will make you feel the same way. It will make you think the same way. It will make you talk the same way. It will make you act the same way. They're very, very consistent. All right? So that's question 3. What does it have me feeling? How do I feel? The first stage of triggering is chemical. You will feel different. You won't feel calm and confident and courageous and all those things that make the spirit. What does it have me thinking? Right? That is the second stage of triggering, is you start to think like the part. Now you're thinking in the flesh. And we all know what that's like, right? I know I do. What does it have me saying? How does it have me talking? When it takes over, the third stage of triggering, talking. Now I'm talking like my part. This is not Christ-like, right? But you'll notice that your parts have a certain way of talking. You might notice that your volume goes up. You might notice you start shouting, or you might just get really, really quiet. Or you might use a different vocabulary. You might start swearing, for instance, right? One of my clients I know recognized her part when she realized that her part swore, but she didn't. It's an interesting one, right? She realized, I don't swear, but my part does, right? And in the fourth stage of triggering, when overwhelm comes, when all 4 stages are there, what does it have me doing? This is when we get into addiction and all kinds of bad habits. Because when it takes over completely, then you're doing what it wants to do. And remember, just like the disciples, your parts are only trying to help you. That's for those people who see Satan under every cornflake. Your parts are just trying to help you. They're trying to make a good thing happen. But it's in the flesh. Right? When Peter cut off the ear of Malchus, he was trying to make a good thing happen. He was trying to protect Christ. But it was wrong. That's how to understand it. Okay? So that's why we can have a good relationship and disciple the parts, because we understand that they're just naive. They don't really get it. At Romans 8 verse 7, as we read out, they can't get into the Spirit unless we connect with them through Christ. And then they become disciples. Does this make sense? Right, if you noticed in the Bible, you'll see Jesus talk to different disciples in different ways. Right? So, as I say, if your part's 7 years of age, you don't talk to it like an adult. Right? How was it constructed, or when I've put there? How was it constructed? It means what type of event made it the way it is. Right? So, for instance, certain types of trauma will have you running. Certain types of trauma will have you fighting. Right? We all know about fight and flight, right? That's your brain, that's your flesh. But we don't always know about flocking and freezing, which are the other two, right? We know about... So flocking is when you try and hide in a crowd, right? Fighting and flighting speak for themselves, but freezing is the most serious. If you've ever shut down, if you've ever thought you can't speak, you can't answer, right? That's a real shutdown. And that's serious trauma, right? But we have to make a start with it to understand that it's our flesh trying to protect us.
So what would we do if we don't necessarily know? Like if we want to pass out and we can't actually remember.
Yeah. Well, the best time when we work with our parts is not in the middle of the difficulty. You can do, But here's an interesting thing. I don't want to keep you too late, but here's an interesting thing about the way neuroscience or biblical method, I say neuroscience because, see, neuroscience is proving the Bible to be true, evidence-based, right? One of the interesting things about how we move away from the medical ideas, in other words, it's not psychiatry, it's not psychology, right? Is that you don't have to get it right. This is very interesting, right? In other words, we want to be explorers, not detectives. The moment you feel yourself moving into the detective role, and I want to know when it happened and who it was, and Professor Plum in the candlestick in the library, we don't want to be detectives. We want to be explorers. Why? Because we don't need to get it right. Remember what I said earlier about giving a good message to our brain, right? Just making a move towards this will give you results, right? Sometimes when I work with a client in this way, they don't even know what they did. That's how simple it can be sometimes. The proof of the pudding is always in the eating, right? When will you know you've rewired or you've been transformed in some area of your life? It may not happen in your whole life, but in some area, what it means is that your brain now trusts you in that area. That's all it means, right? In other words, you're allowed to run your life, right? And when that happens, you will know. You will know immediately because nobody knows your life like you do. And what you will know is that in this situation, for years and years and years, this is how I've reacted. But today I didn't. Today I just responded. Today I was still calm in that situation. Now, you will know that before anyone else does, right? And what you've done is somehow, and we don't quite know always how we've done it, somehow you've discipled that part to trust you. That's all we want, right? Because you'll do the rest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. This is the first time I've been here, so I'm just trying to...
It's a little bit new. Well, thank you so much for being here and really take your time with this, okay? If you want to give your number to Andy, he'll put you on the WhatsApp group. You can join us on Monday night as well. And you can ask all the questions you want, okay? Thank you so much. So I think we're going to leave it there. Write those questions down and just think about them, all right? Don't pressure yourself to be doing too much, too fast, too quick, right? Don't be trying to do something you're not ready to do. Remember cost, okay? Everything this week has been about location. In other words, who am I spending time with and how are they influencing me? And what decisions do I want to make about that? So again, sorry for keeping you late tonight, but be blessed and I will see you at the same time next week. So that's session 4 in module 1, and there is one more session to go. This week we've been talking about location and boundaries, your first part, naming it, unblending, the observer position. There's so much to it, and that's why I'm recording these things, so you can really take your time, study it, go over it. I'll put chapter headings on here so that you can go from any particular part that you want to know a bit more about. So I hope you got so much from that. Be blessed. I'll see you on the next one.